All right, welcome. I'm David Haines, American Security Project. I'm going to give everyone a couple of minutes to filter in here before we get started, but thank you very much for joining us. For those of you who are already here, please note we've got a chat and a Q&A box, so if you've got any questions for the panelists later on, please use Q&A for that. All right, go ahead and get started. As I said, I'm David Haines. I'm the Senior Fellow for Climate Security at the American Security Project. I'm joined today by Judge Alice Hill, the Council on Foreign Relations, Margaret Jackson of the Atlantic Council, and Andrew Holland, formerly of the American Security Project and now of the Fusion Industry Association. Climate security is generally considered either a first-order resiliency issue, meaning threats to military bases and training by floods, hurricanes, wildfires, etc., or a second-order issue, meaning a threat multiplier, or even catalyst for conflicts abroad or difficult challenges in places like the Arctic. Essentially, climate security has been maintaining the status quo, US predominance, in the face of climate change. What we're seeing now, however, is a potential change to the status quo. The globe is on the precipice of massive changes to infrastructure, not only to meet climate goals, but because infrastructure is not currently capable of operating in extreme weather. IEA estimates that investments of $5 trillion per year by 2030 are required to stay on track for climate goals. In light of that, the choices the US makes this summer regarding innovation, infrastructure will have consequences for the US economy, the US's international standing, and the US's ability to partner with other states on projects and financing. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to talk about this today with our panel. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to note there's both a chat box and a Q&A box. Please use the Q&A box for any questions that you have. We'll do Q&A after everyone's gotten a chance to talk. I'd first like to introduce Judge Alice Hill. Judge Hill is the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations. Her work there focuses on the risks, consequences, and responses associated with climate change. She served previously as Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and Senior Director for Resilience Policy on the National Security Council staff, where she led the development of national policy to build resilience to catastrophic risks, including climate change and biological threats. I'm particularly excited today because I'm hoping we'll get a bit of a preview of Judge Hill's new book, The Fight for Climate After COVID-19, which will be published in early September. Thank you very much for joining us, Judge Hill.
Well, thank you for having me here today, and really a pleasure to join this panel. The focus on infrastructure is absolutely essential. We know that infrastructure is key to delivery of very basic services to all of us. Certainly the pandemic showed that. And if the infrastructure fails, if our supply chains fail, there are dire consequences. With infrastructure, we typically want it to last longer. That's what one engineer told me when we were talking about the service life of 50 years, 100 years, or if, in the case of the Romans, 1,000 years or more. Their structures have stood. But virtually all of our infrastructure, David, as you have pointed out, is highly vulnerable now. It was built to withstand a climate that no longer exists. And not surprisingly, when it collides with the new climate that we are living in and which is changing very rapidly, amongst really decade over decade at one point, and now it's year over year, that infrastructure will fail. We saw the Texas grid exposed to high temperatures collapse with people dying in their beds from cold. In the Western United States, we've seen utilities shut down power preemptively to avoid wildfires. We see transmission lines not performing effectively just when people want power most to keep them cool. The challenge is building infrastructure that's resilient, but climate resilience is easier said than done. It will require engineering standards, building codes that focus on performance, not just the life safety of the individuals in the building. In essence, it requires a paradigm shift with regard to how we build infrastructure, where we site it, how we operate it going forward. There's a really stark example of how this will play out. In 2008, California passed a building code for fire. It was considered the best wildfire prevention code ever, at least in the United States. But when the Camp Fire swept through in 2018, there were 350 homes in that community that had been built to that new code. Only 51% of those homes survived the fire. Now, that's a lot better than the 18% of the 12,000 homes that were built before 2008. But I don't think many would consider it a victory when one single fire occurs and only 51% of the buildings are left standing. We need to do better to adjust to new events that are unfamiliar, bigger, and in the case of wildfires, hotter and more destructive than have been recorded in human history. We also haven't gotten the cost-benefit analysis to understand why we need to have better and longer lasting infrastructure. As Mark Carney called this, the former Bank of England head, this is the tragedy of the horizon. We don't have the cost-benefit analysis that has us adjusting in long-lived infrastructure, nor do we have the adaptive design. You know, in the Netherlands, they build for the 1 in 10,000 year flood. Of course, they face an existential threat from flooding with a quarter of the land mass under current sea levels. But they also build infrastructure that can be adjusted over time, and that's what we need. Now, why do we care about this in terms of security? Because every system we have depends on it being operational in a time of climate change, and those systems are failing. And if they fail, it causes food insecurity, water insecurity, and it can cause upheaval and threaten really the stability of nations and governments. So as we look not only in the United States, but as we look outward across the world, we need a collective focus on how do we continue to provide basic services to people in the face of a climate that's unfamiliar, more threatening, and more damaging than the one we've known for the last 8,000 years when human civilization has flourished. So now this is an issue that must move to the very top of the agenda for policymakers in order to ensure that communities are protected going forward. So it's really exciting to have this session here today to discuss the challenges, but also the very important opportunities that are here before us now. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and speaking with my fellow panelists. So thank you so much.
Excellent, thank you. And great opportunity today too to talk about those things. I think Maggie's done a lot of work on that, which is great. She's our next speaker. Margaret Jackson is the Deputy Director for Climate and Advanced Energy at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. From 2019 to 2020, she was a Council on Foreign Relations Hitachi International Affairs Fellow at the Institute of Economics in Japan, where she researched U.S.-Japan energy security cooperation. Prior to working in Tokyo, she was a Fulbright Scholar at the Institute of Energy, Environment, and Economy at Tsinghua University in Beijing, studying implications for Chinese overseas renewable energy investment. She is also a former U.S. Navy surface warfare officer and has briefed senior leaders on U.S.-China affairs and worked in operations and plans related to East Asia under the Chief of Naval Operations. Thank you very much for joining us, Mike.
Thank you so much, David. It's good to see everyone today. And I do agree with everything that Judge Hill said. This is such a timely conversation. Again, we know that the topic of infrastructure is quite broad. And based on my experience, I'm going to speak very specifically to energy and energy infrastructure and what that means specifically for climate mitigation. We just heard how impactful this is, how the terrible things we're seeing in the United States when it comes to wildfires, extreme weather, and we know that this is happening all over the world and that there's an urgency that we need to address this. So the conversations that we're seeing on the Hill, this week, I know that we're following it day by day and it's evolving, but we've seen some interesting progress over the last even 24 hours. And I know we're going to get into that a little bit more, but things like the Energy Infrastructure Act passed through the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee yesterday. We're seeing the key elements of the bipartisan infrastructure package come together, as well as the potential reconciliation bill. And again, I want to speak to the importance of these, especially in the international context, for two reasons. And that comes back first to US credibility in the climate space, especially as a global leader. And also as it relates to competition and setting up the United States to be competitive in the future energy and economic system that we're seeing. So when we're talking about legislation that could support research and development and demonstration and deployment of technologies like CCUS, hydrogen, long duration energy storage, advanced nuclear, and improvements in building efficiency and things like that. That's all incredibly important to show that the US is going to make meaningful progress towards the goals that we've outlined. And we've seen President Biden and his administration come in and set these targets for 50 to 50% in emissions reductions by 2030 through our national determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, carbon-free electricity by 2035, and ultimately net zero by 2050. And we're seeing leaders around the world rallying around that. Of course, not just due to the leadership in the United States, but also due to the rising awareness of climate impacts, and also just the direction of travel where the market is going. But at the end of the day, especially given the last 4 years where the US took a step back as a leader in climate and even rolled back a lot of environmental regulations, it's incredibly important if we're going to be out there, talking to other countries about raising climate ambition, that we're coming from a place where we're taking substantive action ourselves. And we know that policy also plays an important role in sending the right market signals, and also, the legislation on the Hill will set the agenda in many of the agencies across government. And getting to the competition piece, I think Secretary Blinken put it really bluntly when he said it's difficult to imagine the United States winning the long-term strategic competition with China if we can't lead the renewable energy revolution. We know that China dominates in solar, wind, battery production. I'm happy to go into those statistics. And as we think about where the US can compete, we have to think really carefully about how we invest in technologies and how we leverage that going forward, because the other thing is that we know that all countries around the world are trying to meet net zero targets. And the US historically, we have leveraged our energy abundance and fossil fuels in our foreign policy. And again, I'm speaking in a personal capacity. It's very important that we are exporting and investing in the energy system of the future in third countries, and that we're working with allies and partners around the world to help them reach their targets. Because as we've talked about, climate, if we're not mitigating, if we're not reducing emissions, climate is a threat to every country's national security. And the issues that we're seeing, the examples that Judge Hill gave around climate being a threat multiplier, are only going to increase. That's going to have implications for our military. We're already seeing it change both the way that we train as a military and how we operate. And that's only going to continue to be a burden that our military has to bear as they move forward, and as we see more extreme weather and these issues really become worse over time. So at the end of the day, I think what we're seeing in this administration is a foreign policy approach where we're engaging with the world from a position of strength. To be coming from a position of strength, we have to move the legislation forward and actually see these developments start to happen, see the money be appropriated to actually make meaningful gains in these different fields. So I'll stop there. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Fortunately, having Andrew here to talk about some of those new technologies is, it's very fortunate. So we'll move on to Andrew Holland, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Fusion Industry Association. He's worked at the intersections of science, energy, policy, and politics for 2 decades. He's the author of Fusion Power, a 10-year plan for American energy security, first published in 2013, laying out a roadmap for American leadership in fusion. Since creating the FIA in 2018, he's brought together the leading private fusion companies to jointly coordinate on areas of common interest. And previously, he served as Chief Operating Officer for us here at the American Security Project, researching energy, climate change, trade, innovation, and infrastructure policy. Thank you very much for joining us, Andrew.
David, thank you. And I'd note that, all of that work you mentioned, I did on Fusion, I did at the American Security Project. So it's great to be back with you all. And I see some familiar faces here in the attendees list. So great to see everybody. Great to see Admiral Guns on the list there and others. So good to be with you all, at least virtually. Hopefully soon we'll be all able to get back in person, and you guys can use your great in-person live space downstairs there, and we'll be able to do that all soon, or maybe roof deck events. So we should take advantage of that. I'm going to, coming back to think tank world allows me to spend a little bit of time kind of pontificating big picture, and then I'm going to narrow down into this. And so when we think about infrastructure, especially in the American context, there's a deep and rich history of American infrastructure improvements. They were called internal improvements in the early 19th century, and it was Henry Clay's American System. I actually went back and reread part of his speeches. It was a 3-day long speech, so I didn't read the whole thing. They did it differently back then. But the American System of Henry Clay was about roads, canals, internal improvements. These things that really enabled America to become the world power that it would become. The Erie Canal really enabled the growth of the port of New York and made New York the most important city in the country. And things like this were things that knit the country together. And they were also things that were essentially about international competition. If you go back and look at these speeches and the debates, it was all about how to make their economy competitive against the preeminent industrial powers of the time, Europe, France, England, these sort of emerging industrial powers, how to build an industrial base in the United States. You did it with internal investments. You did it with infrastructure. And then, of course, that was built on in the 1860s under Lincoln with the Transcontinental Railroad and the grants of infrastructure to private companies to build railroads across the country. And then again in the 1950s under Eisenhower, it was highways and the interstate highway system and the investments into that. And these things, a couple of things really come out about this. They were done for American internal use, but it was about international competition. In the 1860s, it was a prime national security importance to knit the Pacific coast of the United States to the population centers and the political centers on the East Coast. This was not just, the United States was in the middle of a civil war, and still they passed legislation to build the Transcontinental Railroad, started building that Transcontinental Railroad because the colonial powers of the time were, expanding their empires in the Pacific. It was only 20 years since the United States and Great Britain had agreed to the border between Canada and the United States along what's now the Washington and British Columbia border. It was a live question about whether the United States would be able to protect and keep its recently won gains in California and the American West. So this was a prime national security concern. 1950s too. Eisenhower, of course, built the interstate highway system and advocated for the interstate highway system as part of Cold War internal improvements, the competition with the Soviet Union. This was a prime national security importance to be able to move military units across the country and everything. Now, sometimes we could say that was an excuse to build something that was, getting it done, but it's true. And we make a mistake when we look back on these, and as we're considering a major infrastructure investment now, we make a mistake if we think about just rebuilding those old infrastructures, or only thinking of those mode sources. Infrastructure is only roads, rails, bridges. I mean, nobody would advocate for rebuilding the Erie Canal right now, but we do have to continue to upgrade and update these things, especially in the age of climate change. But we also have to be forward thinking about the technologies that are going to win the future. And so that's where my work now with the Fusion Industry Association comes in. It's really important to kind of think about what's the economic competitiveness of today and the rest of the 21st century going to be. It's about moving electrons as much as it is about moving people and goods. So the infrastructure of the 21st century is about electricity. It's about telecommunications. Think back on COVID here. What's been the key infrastructure that we've all used to enable us to work from home? It's not the highways or the transit to get to work. It's Zoom, it's all of the energy investments and telecommunications investments in this, the internet, all these sorts of things. So we need to be forward leaning. We need to make the infrastructure investments into these as well. Trade and information goes on wires and through wireless communications as much as it goes through ports and roads and rails. And now this is where I get to the point where I say we need an energy infrastructure that is built for the 21st century and beyond. And so I'm obviously advocating as the CEO of the Fusion Industry Association for a major investment into advanced energy. And so I have an op-ed that just came out on Tuesday, and I'll put it in the chat box for people to take a look at on fusion, on why we need to invest in fusion as an infrastructure priority. For those reasons, and also for the international competition. Today, the international competition is China. And we've heard the president and his team talking about how we need to invest in infrastructure to compete with China. They're making these same investments. They're not thinking about the 19th century canals or 20th century highways. I mean, they've already built their high-speed rail system over only the last 15 years. So they're making the 21st century investments, and we need to catch up and make sure that we make our investments today to be 21st century. So I think that's enough. I'll put the op-ed in there. I'm happy to talk more and would love to get more into everything else with everybody else. Thanks.
Thanks, and thanks for putting the op-ed in there. Great. Well, at this point, we are open for questions. So if you do have a question, please put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. But I'll open it up and just ask, because we are seeing a lot of movement now on what is going to be in this infrastructure bill or reconciliation, what will happen. So I'll just open it up to the panelists and say, what are you expecting? What are you looking forward to? What do you think is missing? It's a very, very broad question, but I think there's a lot to cover. So. I'll pick on someone.
I'll speak up. The lens I look at for many issues is, will whatever choices we make now be sound 20, 30, 50 years from now or longer? And one of my concerns is we obviously need to focus, as we've heard from Maggie and Andrew, on infrastructure for competitive reasons. But it's hard to accomplish climate resilient infrastructure. It hasn't been done on a wide scale yet. And what I would hope for from this administration is some kind of strategy or clear plan on how it will accomplish having the necessary building codes, cost benefit analysis, other elements to make sure that whatever we choose to invest in now will prove resilient. And part of that will also require us to look at land use, which is often treated as the third rail when you talk about how we build. And that will require us to think, where do we need to make investments? Should we continue to invest in, for example, beach renourishment as an effort to make sure that a community can still withstand, or do we need to invest in infrastructure that will be longer lasting, even if we have to retreat from our coast to some extent? Those hard questions need to be in the calculus of the choices we make. And in order to truly focus on those, you need a strategy. And that's what I would like to see from the Biden administration. What is the strategy to make sure that everything that we invest in is resilient for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I'd add on that. I agree completely. You know, the nature of politics in Congress. They like to build things and cut ribbons more than they like to protect things or talk about, you know, retreats. And how many times do we see a hurricane come through and everybody immediately rushes there and says, we will rebuild, But we know, you know, we know how much it costs to rebuild versus prevention. I mean, it literally is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But it's a heck of a lot harder to get Congress to spend the money on that prevention than it is to go and get the relief bill done afterwards. Such a difficult problem, and you know, in some ways, the United States is blessed and cursed by being an extremely wealthy nation historically, you know, so that we kind of don't, for a long time, we've not had to make these choices because we can just throw money at it. You know, we don't have to think about what's the long-term plan for New Orleans if we can just throw tens of billions of dollars at levees and more. And so we protect New Orleans, but do we protect everything around it? Not really. It looks like, you know, just huge amounts of retreat and land loss in southern Louisiana, partially because, you know, the water has to go somewhere. So these sorts of things are you know, kind of difficult politics and hard to deal with.
One last thing I'll add on to that is I think a lot of this comes back to good data and good modeling. And I think that's another area where we could see a lot more investment, a lot more public-private partnerships. And you're starting to see some examples of that, and especially within certain localities. But you know, when you're looking at insurance, and insurance is really the reason that we're able to rebuild, but them starting to understand what the risks are longer term, I mean, out 10, 20, 30 years, and you're able to model sea level rise and extreme weather and things like that, we're going to start to see the dynamic change, as we've already started to see in people reconsidering living in Northern California or places like Miami, especially given the recent tragedy. So I just add that as, in addition to the number of technologies that I mentioned before, that the climate data and modeling needs to be an area where we really expand our expertise.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. And the cost of this is about to be astronomical for some of these communities. And they really are, you know, they're local communities that will bear the burden of this. States will, there's federal funding, but you know, where it gets utilized and how is a real open question. Kind of circling back to some of the the thoughts about future technologies and future investments. Maggie, you mentioned places that the U.S. can be competitive or not competitive. Where do we think that the R&D in tech should go, and realistically, where will it go? Will the U.S. become competitive in a lot of these things where it's fallen behind, or will it take the lead in other places? What will happen?
Yeah, I'll start in on that. The United States does best on these sorts of leadership things when investments into research and development, I think, focus most on the research phase, the basic research, and we've seen a steady degrading of those research dollars over the last 30, 40 years, really. A steady reduction. If you look back in the 1960s, during the Apollo program era, the United States was spending about 3.5% to 4% of its GDP on basic research. That's fallen to below 2% now, and significant amounts of that, we don't do the basic research in clean energy and stuff that we need. The advances we've seen in getting stuff like solar and wind onto the grid are because those things were invested in the 1970s, right? So that's basic research and investment from the 1970s. And if you think about today, we've been doing so here's again back on my my area right now of expertise is fusion energy. And so the United States has been doing research on fusion energy, as has the rest of the major powers in the world for 60 years. And that basic research is moving right now from the lab to the commercial space. And what our companies are doing, we have 22 private companies, all funded by private capital, are taking that basic research and moving it into the commercial sector. They're building things, they're moving to the point where they're going to be building proof of concept machines this decade and commercial power plants, commercial pilot plants by the end of this decade. This is a rapid advancement. Basic research does a lot and can take you a long way, but then you need these public-private partnerships to move it from the basic research to the commercial space. And I'd note that the U.S. should do this in areas where it's not yet a commodity. If you think about wind, you think about solar, those are commodity things right now. Those are basically, in the economic terms, it's zero economic profit because prices have been driven down so rapidly by, honestly, the China production facility. It's so easy and cheap to manufacture things in China, solar panels, wind, that sort of stuff, that it's difficult for any high value country like the United States to compete. We're not there on high tech things like fusion energy, also like CCS, carbon capture sequestration, hydrogen economy, these sorts of things. So it's really important to move into the sort of the high tech and to be really forward leaning about that.
If I can just jump in, I completely agree with that. And I think, again, if you look at the statistics of China dominating solar, producing over 75% of panels worldwide, battery production, cells for batteries, I think, are around 78%, and wind is about 65% of all wind turbine manufacturing. So there's certainly a conversation happening in the United States, as we know, about how to develop competitiveness in those areas. And I would say of those, perhaps offshore wind is one potential, but as Andrew was saying, there's a huge opportunity in technologies that are not yet commercial. And I want to say the other thing is that you see a lot of bipartisan support for technologies like CCUS and hydrogen because of the link, again, back to the fossil fuel industries, where a lot of that legacy infrastructure can carry over. You can develop, you can keep for example, natural gas in the energy system, but you can decarbonize it. And so I think there's huge potentials there, and we will see that, going back to your earlier question, David, I think included. But on that same note, though, the Xinjiang issue around human rights and polysilicon production, I think is something that we can't overstate in terms of its importance and how it might shape this conversation. And I'm not sure if people saw Senator Ossoff's Solar Energy Manufacturing for America Act, which I think is really interesting because it brings back tax credits for American solar manufacturing. I'm not sure I agree in following down that path, or at least relying on that path in the near term, say 5 to 6 years, because I think it will take time to develop that competitiveness. And just to put it into numbers, the US's largest solar company, First Solar, has a manufacturing capacity of about 2.4 gigawatts. That's going up by 3.3 gigawatts by 2023. China's largest solar company shipped 24 gigawatts last year. So you're talking a magnitude of 10 times. So I think we have to be realistic in terms of the competition we're up against. So I just wanted to put that out there, because I think there may be some surprises like that come through based on what's happening geopolitically. But I think there's some real hard questions and data analysis we need to do in terms of thinking how we can realistically meet our climate targets, and to what extent we need to rely on China, and to what extent we can work with other partners around the world to do so.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We hear a lot of rhetoric about cooperate or compete, and the fact is this is a very enmeshed, global economy, and there will not be kind of a definite one or the other that occurs as everyone makes decisions about what they need to do in the future. I've got a question from Admiral Lee Gunn saying, risk is paramount in the analytical thinking of the finance sector, especially by insurers and reinsurers. Could you comment on insurance as a forcing function in planning for resilient building and renewal?
I can jump in on that. I head for the California Department of Insurance, the Commissioner Lara there, a working group on climate change and insurance. That work has uncovered some interesting findings. One of the risks with insurance is that insurers may decide that these risks are too big, that they can't really make money on them under the current environment, so they will pull out. We saw that in Florida in 1992 after Hurricane Andrew just flattened neighborhoods and a number of insurers went bankrupt. And we're seeing that possibly emerge in California now as insurers have indicated they do not want to write new policies, and in some instances renew in areas that are prone to wildfires. The commissioner has imposed a moratorium for 2 years running, telling those insurers they can't not renew people on the basis of wildfire risk. That obviously can't go on forever. So how do we keep private insurers interested in insuring property? That is the big issue. We don't have the models of community insurance yet. It's going to require some innovation to make sure that that happens. When in the 60s, flood damages were high, the federal government stepped in and said, we'll become the insurers. And we created the National Flood Insurance Program, which has been struggling for many years to be economically viable and sound. It's about $25 billion in the hole. I may have lost the last count, and it's been very difficult to amend through congressional action. So what you see is the reinsurers. Those are the insurance companies that protect the primary insurers, the insurers that you get your renter's insurance from or your homeowner's insurance from. They insure those. And the reinsurance companies are obviously very worried about this, but the primary insurance companies are still trying to figure out what model they have that will allow them to be profitable in a world of changing risk. And the important thing to remember with those primary insurers is they only write a policy for 1 year. So we're seeing these things worsen over time, and it may be that they choose to leave the market. This is a very important issue for everyone to focus on, because of course, if private insurers do leave the market, that will have very substantial impacts on real estate prices in areas that are at risk. And what you don't want is to have a sudden jolt in the market. That's not good for anyone, but it's a ongoing challenge and will require huge innovation, not only in technological solutions, but really in different kinds of insurance products that are offered to communities, perhaps to mitigate risk across the community. Really important in the wildfire area to think more broadly than just an individual home. So many challenges ahead with that. It's a very important thing to focus on. So thanks for the question.
Can I follow up on that? And I love this chat that just came in. That she's in Miami Beach with inspectors while on the call, and that she has to hop off because they found something. Amazing. But I do. I have a personal sort of. I'd love to get some property in Miami sometime, and so I follow. Home prices and, do the Zillow tracking of everything. Prices continue to go up like crazy in Miami Beach. We know that Miami Beach is flooding, but, everybody wants to be there. The bayfront properties are $10 million. Oceanfront properties are more. We haven't seen, the apartments right next to the place that collapsed are multi-million-dollar apartments. So is the market just not pricing this stuff in, or do people just not care? Or, is it just that, Florida has always been a boom bust sort of place? And how do you it seems like the price increases we've seen in the last 6 months in Florida home prices would dwarf any sort of change in insurance premiums. So it's like, does this matter? I'm sorry to push on you on this, Alice, but what do you think?
Oh, I think there are obviously a number of factors in play. For the very, very expensive homes, I think those individuals just self-insure. They're billionaires. If it's a $50 million home, $10 million home, if we lose it, that's okay. I actually read an article recently with a 75-year-old gentleman who said he grew up not having enough to eat for his first 20 years. He doesn't care that a $75 million mansion might get wiped out. So you have individuals who are so wealthy they can self-insure and take the loss. And then you have a lack of disclosure. Now, I'm not as well aware in Miami, but in most places, there is no disclosure of prior risk. There's a lack of widespread information. FEMA's flood maps, which define what's in the 100-year zone, flood zone, and what's out, are notoriously outdated. I'm not familiar with where FEMA is. There is a new program, and I would encourage just this thought for everyone. If you go to the First Street Foundation or realtor.com, you can type in your address and they'll give you the future flood risk for your home. So it was a private non-NGO that developed these maps, and even FEMA says, that's okay, go use those maps. But just finding the information can be hard. And then we have a political dialogue that says this isn't happening. So we have people discounting, and we know that purchases in real estate for many people are an emotional response. You love the house, you want to invest in it. You don't really want to think about these negative things. What could I have flooding in my front yard? So many factors at play. It's not solely an economic decision. Certainly, if we had better, more easily available mapping and better disclosure of prior risks, and then readjustments to our flood insurance program to properly reflect the true risk going forward, I think you would see a stronger market response. I will say that work by Professor Jesse Keenan has shown that in some areas of Miami, prices are rising in the higher elevations in anticipation of people having to move. But it is really interesting to see multi-million-dollar homes selling above list
Yeah.
right in an area you can see from the photo there at rest.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's a wild concept, and I think that you mentioned beach nourishment before, right? In some cases, beach nourishment is there because we built things close to the beach, and so what costs will be borne by the local and the state and the federal government for these choices we're making now that reduce our ability to invest in other things. There's only so much we can pay attention to and invest in.
Well, I think that's right. Now, that's why we need a strategy. We need to know where should we prioritize our investments? Is it putting more sand back to protect beachfront homes, or is it looking at riverine flooding elsewhere? Other steps that need to be taken across the nation, and we need a way to rank. Who does that protect? At what cost? How long does it last? Really hard conversations. But without them, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, has said, we're just sprinkling stuff around, and it may not add up to resilience in the end.
Not, well, it's not great, I guess.
I can just add that I think that
Yeah.
is beyond the US context. It's a global conversation. And I think we know that mitigation funding, is much, much higher than resilience funding. And one of the pushes in the lead up to Glasgow is seeing a really strong push for helping balance out that discrepancy or that disparity. And I also, within our foreign policy and our agencies like USAID and State Department initiatives, again, so much has been focused on energy, solar home systems and things like that, and from the climate mitigation perspective to a certain extent. But in terms of the climate resiliency, there's a lot more we can do also on the foreign policy side to integrate that. And again, in addition to the mitigation measures. So I think it's a learning process that we certainly need to learn domestically, but also need to translate in our relationships around the world.
I think that's a really great point. If we're going to hit, the goals that we've set, as an international community, to invest in financing, I mean, it's not just putting money into these things; it's putting money very deliberately into different spots. A question from Stephen Myers: upgrading physical infrastructure in the face of climate change is essential. He would add that in the 21st century, a new type of infrastructure is emerging. Artificial intelligence expected to provide increased efficiency and safety. China's pouring a lot of money into AI. Is this something that we should be thinking about and investing in? Are we not investing in it? Does it intersect with the conversation we're having today?
So AI, and several of our companies use AI programming to optimize their experiments and their results, and it is a powerful tool, and that's right. I'm not sure if it's an infrastructure investment though. To kind of push back here, it certainly is a competitiveness investment, but this is something that, I mean, the private sector is investing a lot in this. And if you go to Silicon Valley and look at where the investors are putting money, there's no shortage of dollars going into this. Certainly the Chinese, of course, have their own programming and everything. But I kind of push back here on the idea that the federal government needs to do more. Now, what the federal government really does need to do, especially the military, is making sure that they have access to the private companies that are making these investments here. They created the DIUX a couple of years ago to be able to invest in private companies doing AI. And other advanced sort of things. So the U.S. government needs access, and part of that is military investment into that, and other sort of U.S. government investment to be able to have access to the products, and thinking about ways to make sure that Chinese or other adversaries can't come in with direct investment and take the intellectual property from American private companies. Yeah, so that's investment policy and stuff like that. I don't know that it's properly should be seen of as an infrastructure thing, though.
Well, I would add that I think artificial intelligence is already playing a role, as Andrew has said, in the private sector in climate services. They're taking machine learning, the Internet of Things, AI to better understand where infrastructure failures can occur, where vulnerabilities are, how those things can be shorn up. You know, if this pipe breaks here, what effects will it have elsewhere if you fix this, or whatever. One key point about that, though, as we've talked about the need for modeling, is how do we make this a public good? We've got the private sector there's an arms race afoot to get better modeling, get better information data, and then sell it to private entities, which is great. The question is, will the government provide just a basic set of tools to those communities and individuals who cannot afford to do this on their own? Because if we don't do that, we will see communities fall behind. That's what we already see, because they can't hire the consultant or the firm to do this. So to the extent that artificial intelligence will lead to better outcomes in the face of climate change, a policy question for the federal government is, how do we make sure that that's at least at a basic level available? I just wrote a piece in Nature about this, is that we see these wonderful tools being developed, but for some part-time planner in some town in Alabama, that won't be possible for them to access it unless the federal government has assisted in that process. So the question is, how do they do that? But not squelch the private sector, because that information it could be very specialized, localized for the consumers and clients that need that information as they make decisions. It's a real balancing act that the federal government needs to focus on. So great to call it out.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think those are all excellent points. I mean, I think you can debate whether AI is infrastructure, should be considered infrastructure, but I think at the end of the day, it is integrated into our infrastructure and will continue to be. I think an interesting data point is that State Grid, China's largest electric utility that is worldwide, is one of the top AI companies in the world. So especially from the energy side, you are seeing a decarbonized and an increasingly digitized energy system, and you can go into what the private. You certainly know that the private sector is really forward-leaning in this, especially in the United States. But we also know that China has significant state support, and that goes into academic institutions and research institutes across the board. And in the United States, an important piece that you see a lot of people advocate for is a lot of top companies, the founders are immigrants. So an interesting piece of that conversation is our immigration policy, and as we navigate, again, drawing some clear lines between security interests and educational exchange and things like that. How do we cultivate the talent domestically while being careful around IP theft and things like that, but also creating these pathways for people to continue to be innovative and support that U.S. domestic industry. So it's a very nuanced conversation, but I think an important one, and I'm glad you raised the question.
Yeah, we actually have a question. I think, to a certain extent, you may have answered already, but maybe puts it in different terms. We can talk a little bit more. Peter Charis asks, how would people draw the line between areas that are appropriate for the government and those that are appropriate for the private sector? What principles or standards should guide whether taxpayer dollars are spent or whether private investors' money should be spent?
Well, I think that's a very hard question, but I think we need to look at it from what are the basic needs of communities. And if we know that communities cannot afford to access this information, and that therefore means that they will be vulnerable to worsening conditions, we need to figure out what is a basic level of services. That would be a basic level of climate services, for example, which is talked about both in Congress and by the president. So I'm trying to think of an analogy, but I'm sure there is one out there. Maybe somebody in the audience can think of one. But there are times when the government steps in and says, maybe its analogy is public education. We're going to make public education available to everybody, but if you want to go to a private school, you can go pay a tuition and go to a private school. And we need to figure out what that balance is to make sure that no community is left in the untenable position of not being able to afford the services that would have really outcomes that could save lives and preclude serious damage. As you go beyond that, then there'll just have to be a decision. The government doesn't go farther than this, but we will make sure that everyone has a minimum safety net in terms of understanding of their risk.
And maybe I would go back to, Peter's question is exactly what was being debated and contemplated in those historical analogies that I talked about back before. It was, the internal improvements were championed by the West and by the North, and this was back in the 19th century when those divisions mattered even more than they do now. While in the South, they were against spending those federal dollars, and they were against the tariff because they were happy to import goods from Europe instead of bringing them from the Northeast or bringing in the food products from the West. So this has been something that's been grappled with for a long time. I do go back to, kind of my economics 101 from college that, it's public goods, right? Government investment should go towards things that are public goods. And by public goods, that's defined as things that the private sector either doesn't invest in at all or significantly underinvests in. Education is a prime example of that. The private sector would invest in education, but would invest significantly less than would be best for the public good. The prime examples of this are things like lighthouses, but even roads. Roads, rails. Roads are an example of that because it's quite difficult to exclude people, exclude organizations, and it would just be. It's not that there would be no roads if there was no government, but they'd be a lot less, and they'd be a lot worse, and they'd be exclusionary. So as a country, we're best when we're investing in these public goods, whether it's all these sorts of things. And so when it does get dicey, when companies like mine are starting to argue for public-private partnerships as part of infrastructure. But the idea is that we will provide a public good here. These fusion companies will enable the growth of a fusion industry here in the United States. And same thing for other clean energy advances. And that provides jobs, that provides education needs, that provides export income. Creating a new industry is in a lot of ways a public good, and it's also a competitive thing as well, because if it's not created here, it will be created somewhere, and that's another challenge.
I think that brings us up on an hour, and I think that's a really important place to leave the conversation. Is that when we talk about infrastructure and we talk about innovation, we're talking about something that we're doing for everyone, not just one business or one region of the country. These are problems that are really expanding across. And it's been interesting to me to see the innovation bills be very broadly bipartisan and outward looking, where the infrastructure bills have been less so. And I think those two things should be drawn together more closely. But in conclusion, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks very much, Judge Hill. Thanks, Maggie. Thank you, Andrew. This has been a lot of fun. I'm really glad we got to do it. And hopefully the audience enjoyed it. So yeah, hopefully we'll talk to all of you again soon. And hope everybody has an excellent weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.